Hello and welcome to Programming for Games, Things You Should Know, a BAFTA crew panel at EGX 2020. I'm going to start by introducing the panelists and myself, starting with Husban Siddiqi, who's founder of HUSKRAFTS, independent game developer, currently working on something with the working title of Epic Arcade Spaceflight Combat. We have Ashley Shaw, who's senior technical developer at Jagex and has been at Jagex for almost 9 years, creating and prototyping content and updating some of the older contents on the ever-popular RuneScape. And I'm Pavle Mihajlovic. I'm co-founder and director at Flavourworks. We released a game called Erica last year, and we make primarily deeply interactive live-action games. So as a means to kind of get into it, I think I'd like to ask first how you got started programming for games. Maybe starting with you,
Husban. Yeah, so I guess where the thing is, I actually came from my background is actually in electronic engineering, and I mainly worked in software specifically for embedded applications as well as virtual reality enterprise type projects. So I kind of found my way into games through that side of things, as in when I was developing projects for virtual reality, and that kind of started my interest in actually how you can create, essentially creating experiences that can be interactive, and then that just marries with my creative drive, essentially combining art and technology. And so that's kind of how I found my way into games, is essentially is through those two routes. Was one creative drive and then a technical drive, and that was pretty much it.
Ernest and Ashley.
Yeah, so I've had a love of games since I was quite young. It's always that, and tech was very much my focus. So I did all the usual kind of very high IT spec college courses, went and did a very specific games programming degree at university, and then kind of stumbled through a few jobs, sort of junior programming role at a very small company. Then I did a bit of QA for a while, again, still in games. And then I found my way into Jagex and got myself onto one of the technical roles, and I've just kind of been programming since, really. But yeah, that's pretty much it, really. Just kind of just that love of basically playing around, watching how the games feel, play, and just kind of wanting to prove that I can do that, basically, and just follow the dream that I had as a young kid. So yeah.
Yeah, I think we do have like a bit of a spectrum. I guess my path like different as well. So I started programming games when I was, when I was maybe like 15 or 16, and eventually when I was 18, found my way to an internship at 22 Cans down in Guildford with Peter Molyneux. So then kind of just started kind of straight from there. So yeah, I guess there are like many different ways that people get into this line of work, which is interesting. And I think that one of the things that I'd like to discuss is there's obviously the part of this job that is the actual programming of like sitting down and writing code, but there's the entire part of the job that is around all of this, and sometimes you'll hear described, usually in LinkedIn articles, as the soft skills versus the hard skills. And I'd like to discuss a little bit about how you found that the parts of the job that aren't programming, and how you've managed that, and how important you think that is. Perhaps starting with you, Ashley, because you're in a slightly bigger organization than
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, most of my sort of stuff is generally make sure you can communicate, but you need to make sure that who you're talking to may not necessarily be technical. So for instance, maybe talking to like a production manager or something for the code you're trying to write. They may know nothing about the way you're coding it up. They don't care about the way you're coding it up, but you need to tell them like what you plan to do, how long it's going to take you to do it, and that sort of stuff, really. Like you kind of need to bear those things in mind. So just kind of making sure that you can not necessarily dumb down what you're doing, but making sure that you can spell it out in a way that everyone kind of can understand it. That's probably the best way of doing it, of sort of probably describing that sort of stuff, really. Also, make sure you've got a good spell checker on your computer. That's always a good one.
Yeah.
I went into that trouble a lot.
Yeah, I'm definitely writing more emails than I thought I would have when I first started down this path. And Husban, you're more of an independent game developer, so your role is probably even perhaps a bit wider in terms of like who you have to communicate with.
Yeah, no, so no, that's a really great point, and Ashley touched on it so well, because I think for games it's a bit of a misnomer just thinking it's about making the game. There are a lot of wider skills required in order to kind of bring that kind of thing to life. And especially when you have to communicate. So for context on this project, it's not just me. I work with an artist, and I work with other individuals as well. It's still small, but even having to communicate, I mean, it might be cliched, but communication is such an essential skill, and understanding how each creator has a mindset or kind of approach to things, and if you don't necessarily, you kind of have to understand what way to communicate with them in order to get the best result out, especially at smaller scale, where you can't really afford to let too many things slip. So definitely understanding each discipline can be important and invaluable, because then you can just actually be able to it can make the process of making a game go so much smoother if you're able to communicate with clarity. So yeah, I would say that's one side of it. And then the other thing is, at the smaller scale as well, it's so important to have what for whatever project you're doing, to at least have a clear idea of where it's going, because because you can't just make it up on the spot. The way that games are, yes, they are a fluid process, but by the same token as well, you can't there's just you want to minimize the amount of error you're at, especially if you're at a smaller scale, so to speak.
Yes, and that go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say that still holds true for even a bigger company. We make sure that we put like plans in place for new content and stuff, like easily a good couple of months in advance, to make sure that everything is there and ready to just kind of be used and converted into the necessary processes that need to run through the company between all the other sort of disciplines and stuff. So
and you want everyone to be on the same page, right? Because it is there is that creative element to it, and especially when it comes to creativity, you want that trust between everyone who's working on a project. And so that's why in a way I kind of emphasize the communication side of it, just because I find when everyone has clarity on what's going on, the progress that happens between when everyone's on the same page versus everyone doesn't have a clear idea is just such a huge contrast, and it makes a huge difference, honestly.
Yeah, I think one of the points that you made about the importance of knowing ahead of time and the planning and the forecasting element of it is super important. And it was perhaps something that like surprised me when I first became a games programmer, that even as a very junior member of the team at the time I joined as a programming intern, I was being asked, how long is this going to take? Or even like for a longer task, could you break this down into the plan of how you're going to do it, and then how long those bits are going to take? Because I was used to, if I'm working at home by myself and I want to do something, I'll just get it started. I'll find out how long it takes when I do it. But there is, because of there is a team of people involved in making these games, and there are business decisions as well to be made based on forecasts and plans. It's a really important skill to develop, this of knowing ahead of time how to have a good estimate and how to communicate that estimate and how certain that estimate is, that I'm still improving at.
And I totally agree with that. And I think that's the bit that's missed is like it's seen as you kind of make the thing and it happens, but that's a bit of a, you know, misdirection, as in it really is understanding where each discipline fits into the process and how that comes together to create the output.
Yeah, we can also add on top of that like personal time management, which kind of flows into the whole forecasting and planning stuff. Like if you can manage your own time really well, you should be able to allow that flow to happen quite easily. But sort of having that time to plan, make sure you know what is coming, what has been, then hopefully you won't have any surprises that will just kind of randomly just sort of throw themselves at you and just be like, oh, what am I doing?
No,
but
that's it, right? As in the surprises generally come from not just that, because it's even that small amount of looking ahead of where, because you can usually plot to some extent where it's going, and just that small amount of looking ahead can make such a huge difference towards the end process, you know?
Yeah, and I think so. Ashley, as a senior technical developer, and Husban as a founder, how much of your jobs is programming, and how much of your jobs is managing and planning and doing some of these other tasks that we spoke about?
I feel mine's changed as I've moved through the company. I think when I started, it was very much sort of maybe a 60-40 split towards the planning section when I first started. So I'd be a lot more planning when I started out, making sure that anything that I write down goes through all the seniors, make sure they're all happy with what is essentially being developed. As I got through some of the years, it probably turned to about a 50-50 split. And now more, as I kind of know more, understand more of the engine and my personal time management and everything else, it's probably more of a 60-40 split towards the programming side. Like I feel I can quite happily knock out a good technical document very quickly and actually get into the programming side of things. But that's only come purely through experience and just doing it and making sure that it gets done and read by the proper people at the appropriate times. But yeah, I feel that's kind of, as I've kind of come through, that's kind of how it's kind of, at least for me, has evolved. So, but I feel like I'm doing a lot more programming now because I've learned how to do that forward planning, learned how to break everything down a lot better. And I know kind of how I can work with the engine, its limitations, its advantages, and where I can push it right to the edge. So,
Husban?
Yeah, I think if I had to give an estimate, I think maybe it's about 40-50% of my time is programming, because when I'm not programming, I'm doing an art review. If I'm not doing an art review, I'm listening, like going over the audio. And if I'm not going over the audio, you know, I'm going over the design, because and that's the other thing as well, is even there is that separation between design and programming as well, because design is, you know, towards the experience, whereas programming, so to speak, I guess, would be the systems that drive it. And so half the time, even with that programming, it's, am I needing to create a system that I then need to go and tune, or am I spending my time in the system creating something within it? That, and I know I keep circling back to the point of that games are far more than just creating them, but there's this whole other side to it where you have to think about how you are going to sustain the project, how are you going to present it, as in when you share it publicly, or even internally, how you go about testing it. So there are a lot of other factors outside of creating it that I really want to emphasize, because as I said, I initially came from a background where my focus was just on making the project come together, whereas independently, it's not just about the project, but it's also about all of the other elements around it to hopefully drive it forward and or sustain it. And yeah, so I guess the short answer to that is I wish I had more time, or rather my time was spent just programming and just doing the systems. But you know, I can say like this week, like the majority of it was spent on programming activities. And that's the thing, if you're independent, is that it goes far, your responsibilities far go beyond just whatever discipline it is you're kind of having to focus on.
Yeah, my experience was maybe perhaps kind of the opposite of what Ashley seeing, and perhaps in between, sorry, in between both of you, because I started essentially as the solo programmer at Flavourworks, but now I'm very much not. That we have a team of around 6 programmers at the time, and some of whom are more experienced game programmers than I have. So my job has become more about setting up the infrastructure and making sure that they're in a position to do the best work they can, and then managing that whole process of planning and distributing, and kind of some of the more longer term tech work, because we are developing our own tools and our own platform and our own engine. So it's become more about some of the more company-wide management role as time's progressed, and less of my time has been programming, which has its pros and its cons. I do enjoy some of the work, and sometimes I do miss just spending a whole day, strictly programming without any emails.
But I was just going to say, though, see, that's the switch or transition, right? All of a sudden is your activity is all of a sudden the activities you have to focus on are wider, as in, initially it was just focus on what's at hand, but then now it's more like you're also looking at the wider picture as well.
Yeah, which I think also the wider picture is always important to consider. And one of the things that I'd like to discuss, because I think it's a decision that a lot of people face, is this question of whether to build your own tech, or to use some of the available middleware that's quite good. And I think, again, we have kind of both, all sides of the spectrum. So we at Flavourworks, we do have our own engine and our own tool that we use, because these are quite specific and quite tailored to our needs, which are to make these deeply interactive live action games. Husban, I believe that you use Unreal at the moment.
Yeah, I'm using Unreal Engine.
And how have you found that?
Unreal. So just as a primer, this essentially, because of my background, I've kind of touched on all points. So as in, built something with OpenGL, never would do it again. That's not a knock against OpenGL, but I mean, it's the difference between having to create the tools to sustain your project versus just kind of being able to hit the ground running. Unreal Engine is great. It's incredibly flexible, and the nice thing about it is just most of my time isn't spent technically figuring out how to implement something, but rather I can lean a bit more towards design than having to create systems. But overall, it's a really nice flexible package, because at the end of the day, it's supported by it supports multiple platforms. It has a lot of features built in. It's designed, I mean, it's used to build games, and you can definitely feel that when you're working in the editor. And the flexibility it offers for both designers and programmers is quite unique. In the sense that they have a visual scripting language, so you can literally just create nodes, and those nodes will then operate similar to a program, or if you really want to get performance out of your project, you can do it in C++. And yeah, essentially not having to worry about the technology side of it is really great. That can also have its drawbacks if systems get changed. I mean, for instance, they did an audio update, and I had to redo a lot of the audio for my project to get it similar sounding before they updated the engine. So there's that, but then by the same token as well, I didn't have to build it from scratch. So I would say that's the advantage you get. It's a lot easier to get up and running with all the available game engines out there. And what I would just add to this is that there is no silver bullet when it comes to a game engine. I mean, I use Unreal because that works for me, but there are so many other great options as well. Unity is another option out there, and then there's also this engine called Godot, which is open source and free. And my only advice from that side is don't necessarily go with an engine because it's just outright recommended. Mainly go with the engine that works to the way that you expect it to work, because it makes the project go a lot smoother if you're comfortable with the tools versus having to fight it to get certain features out of it.
Yeah, and Ashley, I understand so that the RuneScape code base is essentially built from the ground up for RuneScape, but it is at this point quite mature.
Yeah, pretty much. So RuneScape started, I think, what was it now, 2001, I think. So we're looking at like a 19-year-old engine. Back in those days, the founders didn't have any sort of middleware option, I believe. So they obviously wrote everything that they knew from scratch, which was all in Java. And since then, obviously we've just kind of built on top of it with all of our needs that we've had to. So it is very, it's built as an MMO, but it's kind of specific for RuneScape. So we've got our own in-house tools, as well as sort of all of the pipelines and stuff are all done in-house. Those are slowly migrating now to use more sort of industry standard kind of programs, but it's taken its time to do so. So we've got a lot of very clever programming talent that is slowly converting all of this stuff. But yeah, it's different. It's challenging. So we have a scripting language that I primarily code in. It's quite restrictive in some senses, but it's also quite open in others. So it's kind of one of those things that obviously it's built for its needs, does what it needs to be done. But yeah, I don't really know much more to say otherwise.
Yeah, I think our situation is perhaps closer to yours at Flavourworks, because we have built our own tools, but they are essentially built less time ago. So we started this whole process perhaps like 3 or 4 years ago, and it is an important business decision because it'll shape kind of what your priorities are, and then it'll also shape a little bit of what the product is going to be, because I think that the tools do end up shaping the product, and it also shapes a little bit of what the product that you're making really is. If it is a game, or you're making a game and the associated platforms that you'll then use to either make more games or support the game that you're making for the next 19 years in this case for RuneScape. So there are, I think, some benefits oftentimes to building your own, but it is, I think, a very nuanced decision that needs to be taken carefully.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely something you definitely need to consider doing these days. With obviously, as Husman said, there's a lot of good engines out there that can cater to your needs. You just need to research a bit into them and just choose the way that you would like to go. If nothing out there does anything you want it to do, then yeah, build your own engine. But it will take time. It will definitely take time to do. It's not just a simple, oh yeah, we'll just build it overnight thing. It's, as you said,
because you're building the technology that because it's not even you're making your game first. You're creating the underlying technology that within it you can then create your whatever
game on top of it. Yeah.
And I mean, I have seen there are some benefits to rolling there are definitely indies out there that are rolling their own tech, much to their benefit, shall we say, because they are able to dictate the performance, so to speak, of how well it runs on a platform. Whereas if you are choosing to use a, third-party vendor, for lack of a better term, you essentially have to work within the bounds of what they have created, and that's it.
Yeah, I remember reading an example about The Witness. It's a game I like, and there are, slight spoiler, but there are puzzles in that game that rely on accurate reflections, right? And because they had they had a lot of freedom with what they did with their technology, because they were essentially writing most of it from the ground up, they could gear their engine in such a way that they could have accurate reflections at all their supported quality levels. And a lot of times that stuff is possible using middleware, but it is sometimes slightly more restrictive, which it simply depends on the kind of project that you're doing, and also the expertise of the people that you're working with. It also tends to shape hiring decisions. Depending on how you choose to build your tech, it'll possibly shape the kinds of programmers that you need to work with and the kind of programmers that you can work with.
And also, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, obviously, with middleware, you just need to think of them as they're trying to slightly be a jack of all trades. Mm-hmm. So you may get better performance in certain areas, but not necessarily the ones you're working with. So.
I was just going to say, you're absolutely right when it comes to a skill standpoint as well, because essentially, if you say, oh, I'm working with this technology, some people may have that familiarity or not. Whereas if you're on the more specialized route, there's the potential of it being more of a learning curve, that they have to get used to that workflow, so to speak, before then kind of being up to speed, so to speak. I mean, it cuts both ways, but I find, if it's readily available online, there's generally that familiarity versus something that's more independent, so to speak.
Yeah. Which, speaking of jack of all trades, is also one of the questions here, is about like whether as a professional, we choose to go down the path of being, say, a jack of all trades, or specializing more in a specific area of games programming. And so I think my understanding is that we're all on this panel more towards the jack of all trades side of the spectrum, where we all kind of do a bit of everything. But there are also people who possibly specialize in graphics programming or network programming, or specifically AI, especially in bigger companies. And I think the question here is whether you've made that decision in your career, and how you made that decision. Perhaps starting with you, Ashley.
So I think it was a decision on my part. I did try and I started looking at university when all the courses came up for the final sort of years of modules and stuff. There was things for rendering, as well as sort of gameplay and middleware and stuff. And I kind of looked at them and went, I don't like the look of rendering. It scares me a little bit. And then there was like I like the idea of kind of the middleware kind of gameplay style stuff. So that was kind of where I went with a very generalist kind of role. Like just try and build the stuff that for me at least, the stuff that I build is primarily either for players to see and what they do, interact with in the worlds and stuff, or it's the kind of slightly underlying systems that others kind of can pull from to generate the stuff that people see. So that's the kind of thing that I've always kind of enjoyed seeing, sort of watching games, watching how they kind of interact with things and going, could I make that? That looks kind of fun. And that's sort of, I think that's how I've kind of sort of rolled into that, as instead of a very specialized thing with, say, networking or AI or sort of the sort of rendering graphical side of things. But yeah.
Yes, I think so. Both me and you, has been coming from smaller teams, were perhaps generalists by necessity.
Yeah, that is such a good way of putting it, because essentially when you're on a small team, it is kind of like this role needs to be filled, like, like, okay, I guess I'll try on that hat and see how well it goes. And I think that's just, I think it's just generally more my personal nature, is just curiosity with how different things work. And I've certainly reached the point where I know, okay, yeah, I'm useless at this, so I'm gonna step away from that. But there, essentially, it's, if I know I can, shall we say, competently handle something, I'll generally work with it. And I think a great example of that is how, as I said on my project, I'm working with an artist because I know I don't have the speed, so to speak, to work in a 3D program to turn around things, whereas someone who, unfortunately, the artist I'm working with has that grounding and knows what they're doing. So they will ultimately turn around something quicker than I could in the same space of time. And I mean, I guess what it also boils down to is time, right? And where your trajectory is, because if essentially I find specialization doesn't necessarily happen out of wanting to go in that direction. It comes naturally as time progresses and you keep working. So some folks end up being specialized just because they just find it's the field they want to keep working and want to progress further into it. Whereas being a generalist on one part can come from necessity for sure on smaller teams. But I also know some folks who are just interested in understanding the wide gamut that games have. I mean, it's somewhat crazy to think just how, doesn't matter which discipline you're on, there is a subset you'll find of a specific kind of, whether it be design or programming, audio,
Yeah.
narrative, just everything can have its own specialization. And yeah, I mean, for myself personally, it comes from both curiosity and necessity, but for some people, it's what they're naturally inclined towards.
Yeah, I think for some bigger project, it simply becomes a necessity. When if it's a product that's trying to stay at the state of the art of rendering, it is time consuming to be reading all the SIG graph papers that year and implementing a bunch of new techniques every year. And the same thing goes for a lot of other areas. Network programming, I find just hard to actually get my head around. And I have worked with some specialists because some would say that online games are actually not even possible to make.
It is. I mean, the it's funny you bring up networking, because I think about, you go through creating a project running independently on a single device, right? And then on top of that, then to do some wider testing, you test it on, like, shall we say, different hardware configurations just to see how well it runs or if any glitches can occur, which I've personally experienced where a glitch was happening on someone else's machine just because they didn't have drivers or something along those lines. But then I feel like networking is this added layer of absolute complexity because you're now thinking of having to run an experience consistently between two clients, and there are so many decisions and variances. I mean, at least if it's on one person's machine.
Yeah.
Well, and you're not even
machine,
you're
right?
not even developing just the clients. You're developing a backend solution that I'm sure Ashley has.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I've
been
had some
living
very
with.
fun times with
I
those.
mean,
Yeah.
networking can be its own thing that you could unpack, but
Yeah.
yeah. Um,
That's the main thing that we're coming out of this panel is online
networking.
games are really hard, but they
Online
are
games
really hard.
and don't
They
do
are
them.
very hard. Yeah.
But also like, you know, the kind of the depths that graphics programming can go, it can also get like really hard. But I think that's what's cool is that there is this kind of like option of working like on everything a little bit, and then there's also the option of really kind of narrowing down and going super deep into one of these areas that's endless. You know, that there are people that are just, you know, doing new research at the cutting edge of graphics technology and just making up new techniques and making up new techniques for network programming.
I just
Which
wanted
I
to
think,
say, oh, sorry, I was just going to say briefly, tangentially, the best example I can give of something so specialized you wouldn't even necessarily know it's a thing is I'm aware that like there's one company that literally has one team dedicated to rigging monsters. And the reason why I'm raising that is because that's how specialized you can get. It can even reach the point where you are working on something so specific that you're not even covering, you know, any of the other areas that can happen. So, I mean, I know
yeah,
that's more art than programming, but that's kind of the point, is that there are a lot of topics that subtopics within subtopics, so to speak.
I think probably the best TLDR for this is try a bit of everything first, then just see what you enjoy the most of, and then if you feel like you want to go further into it, go further into it.
yeah. And it's often a very natural process where people joining a company will start as a more kind of general position,
Yeah.
and then as they progress in their careers, they will slowly specialize if they want to, and it's not always a necessity. Which is perhaps the last thing that we could discuss is kind of career progression. So, how have you found kind of the progression of your career? And I think that there are like certain choices that can also be made in this kind of like the path. You know, I know programmers that have started as programmers and essentially became producers as time went along. And I know programmers that did not want to go down that road and you know, specialized and became simply uh, more experienced and more specialized programmers who do perhaps a bit of managing and a bit of planning and forecasting. So are those decisions that you've been making across your career, or is that something that's been happening quite naturally? Perhaps starting with you, Ashley.
Yeah, my career's kind of spans, I think, every corner of a games industry, I think, bar like artistry. So I've had my time in QA. I've done QA. That was good fun, actually. It taught me a lot about that side and what to expect. I've had a go at production. Sorry, excuse me. And that sort of side of things of managing others and trying to get them, making sure they're on track with everything. And then I've come back to coding, which I've stuck with. So even from within then, I've had a couple of chances to potentially go into a more sort of, I guess, a technical directorish kind of role, which is obviously managing other programmers and making sure that they're keeping on top of things. But I didn't enjoy that sort of thing. I'm very focused on sort of logistics and making sure things flow correctly and stuff, and the whole production side of things just didn't really work with my kind of mindset. So I've basically just kind of progressed my role to make sure that I become better at programming, making sure that the knowledge that I obtain can be shared and distributed to some of the juniors and everything else. Sort of being in a senior role, I see a lot more code reviews and making sure that I sort of not necessarily put my mark on things, but make sure that I voice concerns, asking them why they've necessarily done those things that way, and trying to give a different option as to, well, why haven't you thought about doing it this way? That kind of stance. So, but yeah, that's kind of how my kind of career's evolved, really. Like I said earlier, sort of, I still do quite a lot of programming, which is great. But there is kind of that, I wouldn't say managerial side of things, but more of a knowledge share and kind of trying to be that older brother, essentially, to some of the younger lot of making sure they're kind of keeping up with their stride. They're sort of making sure that the decisions that they're making, that they can kind of back it up for why they want to do it. Sometimes they are correct. I just like to sort of question as to, are you sure you want to do it this way? That kind of thing. Just to keep them sort of like, make sure that they're thinking about what they're doing. That's kind of my sort of role really at the moment. I've kind of slowly progressed up through that way with the programming side of things. But yeah, that's kind of where I plan to stay, and hopefully move up to a slightly more the next step up for me is a principal, which is kind of the top dog, as it were. But it's not looking at it that way. That sounds all big-headed and stuff, but it's definitely a lot more kind of distributing knowledge wealth and making sure that the juniors are on the right path to make their way through the company in their career that they want to take.
I think that's super important to think about it and to know kind of what we want, because oftentimes, you know, it's completely possible to get like the sort of position that you want there. There are positions where it's more mentoring based, but perhaps not managerial. There are positions that are more managerial, but not mentoring based. And there are positions that are more strictly programming focused. And I think that knowing what you want and knowing what I want, and then kind of moving in that direction is important, because it can happen that people end up in positions that they don't enjoy, and perhaps they could have ended in a position that they enjoy more. So it can happen that a person that really enjoys programming ends up in a position where they're not programming very much, and now they're simply like not as happy at their job, and they're not as maybe they're not even as efficient. And oftentimes the position can be resolved. You know, there's a discussion and there's a readjustment of the work, and it will, you know, go back to being as efficient as possible.
Yeah, it definitely comes back to that communication aspect of you know, just talk to people at the end of the day. Like, you know, you can resolve 99% of anything that you're struggling with just by talking to someone. Yeah,
absolutely. Husban, how have you found?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I would say I never expected to end up in games. Like I mean, I loved playing them as a kid, you know, and still love playing them. But the funny thing is, I never expected to end up in games, and I think, and just to touch on a point that Ashley said that I think is so important, is that it's just kind of, and I mean, like, the other thing is that things can change as well. Like that's the other thing, is where your preference currently is now can shift even in the space of a year. But I guess the main thing is that the advice I would, so to speak, say is definitely trying out roles, because you never know which one will fit. You know, like I said, I went electronic engineering. Through electronic engineering, I found I was not interested necessarily in doing things on the hardware side of it, and I was much more inclined towards software. And then it was through software that was doing projects in VR, and then through that's how I kind of slipped into games. And I just want to preface that all of those things just naturally came with where I just happened in what basically in the line of work that I was doing anyways. So I guess the point is you just don't necessarily know all of those things, but as you said, kind of work towards the direction that in a way feels, that you're more inclined to, so to speak. Because electronic engineering was incredibly valuable to me to just have a, just to see, I mean, so to speak, it allowed me to try out a lot of things just to figure out the thing that I was actually inclined towards or interested in. And yeah, that's kind of what I would say is just see something that you're interested in and go towards that. And then that's only when you'll really know whether or not you're comfortable with it or if it,
Yeah.
if it suits you,
Yeah, I think that's a good note to end on as our time runs off. Yeah, it's important to, I think, to continuously reevaluate what you're enjoying, what you want to change, and hopefully communicate those preferences and move into the parts of this big field that you enjoy the most. I thank you very much, Ashley, and thank you very much, Husban.
Thank you.
Thank you as
Thank
well
you.
to BAFTA crew and to EGX. And I thank you very much for listening as well.